Hey there, you've just found incredible medicine. Hit like and subscribe to discover stories you won't believe.
It all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back. The man thought it was just a rash or an insect bite, something that would fade on its own. But within weeks, the itch turned into a hard lump that grew larger and more disturbing with each passing day. When he finally went to the hospital, doctors expected a routine case. But the moment they examined him under surgical lights, they realized this was far from ordinary. What they discovered growing from his back left the entire medical team frozen in disbelief, and the man horrified at what he had been carrying all along. They called him Daniel in the chart, though most people simply called him Dan. He had always done things himself, patching roofs, building shelves, restaining fencing in the sun until the cedars smelled like pepper and smoke. The itch began at the bottom of his right shoulder blade. He remembered the first night he noticed it because he had been sanding a rough plank, and a sliver had snapped toward him. He brushed at his shirt, muttered, went back to work. The itch came and went like a nagging thought, then sharpened. By the third week a ridge had appeared beneath his skin, hard, coin-sized, then walnut-sized, then bigger, as if his body had been swallowing a secret and couldn't keep it hidden. He waited because people like him always waited. He tried hot showers, a heating pad, a borrowed antibiotic cream. He blamed age. He blamed dust. He blamed the neighbor's cat, which had brushed his legs at the fence and startled him into swatting his back. When he finally made it to the clinic, the intake nurse measured his blood pressure and told him gently to breathe. A resident doctor prodded at the lump and said, "Epidermal inclusion cyst, the way you might say. Rain on Tuesday." Routine. A simple in and out. But under the surgical lights, with the sterile drape taped into an oval window, the routine peeled away. As soon as Dr. Klein incised the taut skin, a sour, metallic odor rolled up from the wound, the kind of smell that snapped heads even behind masks. Instead of the buttery, pearly material expected from a benign cyst, a clotted matrix of fibrous tissue and grainy yellow particles pressed outward, as if the mass had been packed with damp sand. The attending paused, eyes narrowing. "Hold pressure. Suction." He widened the incision a fraction, and the suction canister began to chatter. The yellow grains, sunflower seeds small, gritty, were embedded throughout the fibrous pocket. At the base, something dark glinted. Dr. Klein eased his forceps around it and lifted a slender wooden fragment, pitted and ragged, 2.5 inches long, stained nearly black. It came out like a thorn finally giving up. The scrub tech's gloved hand hovered, and the room simply stilled. For a long beat nobody said anything. This had not been a routine cyst. It was a granuloma that had walled off an old intruder, a colony of organisms thriving around a forgotten shard of wood that had lodged between muscle planes and invited a slow catastrophe. The pathology came later. In the moment, all Daniel felt was an animal's shame, a heat rising up his neck as if he had been caught with something indecent. He tried to twist up on the table to see and was pressed gently back by a nurse with kind eyes. "You're okay," she said. "We've got you." Her name was Ria. She spoke in low tones while the attending debrided the pocket, removing necrotic tissue and irrigating again and again until the suction line ran clear. "You're going to hear terms that sound scary," she said. "We deal with this. Sometimes a splinter or thorn goes deeper than you realize. Your body tries to wall it off. That's what bodies do. It doesn't mean you did something wrong." In recovery, Dr. Klein explained what they had found growing from his back. A chronic foreign body granuloma. The yellow grains they had seen were sulfur granules, a misleading name for clumps of bacteria, Actinomyces species, partnered with other skin flora, knitting themselves into a fortress around the wooden fragment. It had been there for months, maybe longer, the perfect scaffold for infection, fed by tiny sinus tracts that explained the itch that had started it all. The man listened and kept his hands folded, because if he didn't, they would shake. They started him on high-dose intravenous penicillin while they waited for culture results, which later confirmed the diagnosis. Infectious disease consulted, Dr. Sato, whose gray hair looked like soft wool under fluorescent lights. He laid out a map of weeks and weeks of antibiotics, meticulous wound care, and the possibility of returning to the OR to ensure all infected tissue had been excised. The man did not sleep well that first night. Hospitals had their own weather, air whispered through vents and curtains breathed. Every turn tugged at his dressing. Every beep threatened to turn into an alarm. He thought about the itch on his back that had seemed like nothing, about how it all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back, and he imagined reaching backward to pluck a sliver out of time, changing the moment when he had brushed at his shirt and gone back to sanding. He had been carrying wood inside his body like a bitter talisman. He had been carrying a colony, an architecture of persistence. The words from the title of his own catastrophe kept circling. What they discovered growing from his back left the entire medical team frozen in disbelief, and him horrified at what he had been carrying all along. By morning, the room had shifted from shock to routine. Ria swept in with the gentle authority of someone who knew what hurt and what helped. She changed his dressing, irrigating the pocket. The wound had been left open to heal from the inside out, packed with gauze that wicked away moisture. "You can watch if you want," she said. He nodded and tried, but the sight of his own body's hollow made his chest tighten. He stared at the white tile instead while she narrated how granulation tissue would build up, how the edges would contract. Everyday miracles disguised as chores. His daughter, Leah, arrived around noon, hair damp from the rain. They had not been close for years. Every time they talked, they stepped on the same broken glass. She stood by the bed and listened while he summarized in fewer words than the situation deserved, as if scooping water from a flooded room into a teacup. Her face furrowed and softened. She pinched the bridge of her nose and looked at the ceiling as if asking for patience from whatever lived up there. "Dad," she said finally, "you can't keep doing this. You can't just tough it out because you don't want to bother anyone." He started to say that it all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back, that he had thought it was nothing, that anyone would have thought that. But her eyes told him this wasn't about an itch. It was about 1,000 small dismissals of discomfort, a lifelong habit of swallowing pain until it formed a shape others could see. The story did not end with the foreign body lifted onto a tray. It complicated. The culture results revealed not only actinomyces but also a filamentous companion that suggested the wooden fragment had carried environmental organisms from his workshop into his body. The infectious disease team tailored his antibiotics with the measured language of people who understood both urgency and patience. He tolerated the infusions reasonably well. He learned the choreography of antibiotics: premedicate, flush, infuse, flush again. He learned that eating plain yogurt steadied his stomach. He learned the way pain receded into a manageable ring around his shoulder blade when he breathed deeper and slower. Dr. Klein returned with the pathology report fully signed. "We got clean margins on what we removed," he said. "But these organisms form networks. If you feel feverish, if the drainage changes, if you notice the skin around the site turning hotter or redder, you come in. No waiting." "I mean it." The man nodded. He did not plan to wait for anything again, not for this. At home, the house felt both familiar and altered, as if someone had shifted the furniture by an inch. The shower that first day was a negotiation with tape and plastic and gravity. Leah hovered, wanting to help, not quite knowing where to put her hands. They fell into a kinder pattern than they had in years. She set reminders on her phone: the antibiotic schedule, dressing changes, a follow-up clinic visit. She labeled a tall clear bin, wound care, and filled it with saline, gauze, ointment, tape, gloves. She posted a sheet on the fridge with checkboxes: morning irrigation, midday assessment, evening packing. The man stared at that list and felt, unexpectedly, safer. News of what they had discovered growing from his back traveled through his small circle in the way startling news always did. The neighbor, Marco, came by with a casserole and a story about a splinter that had once lodged under his fingernail and traveled farther than he imagined. The mail carrier knocked and admitted she had Googled sulfur granules, and was very sorry she had. People tended to turn strange medical facts into parables about underestimation. "It's the small things," someone said on his porch, shaking their head. They don't start out small, the man said, surprising himself. They start out ignored. Pain, for him, became a teacher with a droning voice. He learned anatomy by ache, where his latissimus tugged when he reached too far, where the trapezius grumbled if he tried to lift a grocery bag. He slept on his left side, propped by pillows like sandbags against a flood. He forced himself to walk around the block even when the September air bit. He found that the ache eased when he moved, that the worst minutes were the ones he spent anticipating the next worst minutes. There were setbacks. On the 12th day, the drainage turned thicker and tinged with green. The skin warmed. He saw it as soon as he unpacked the wound. There was a feeling like a key turning in a lock. He didn't wait. In the emergency department, an intern asked him to describe his pain on a scale of 1 to 10. And he said 7 because 7 felt like the right kind of honesty. Dr. Sato met him there, eyebrows drawn. You did the right thing, he said, and they adjusted the antibiotic regimen again, adding coverage for Pseudomonas. Cultures grew a new suspect, likely introduced along with the Woods retirement. Yet even this detour carried him somewhere useful. He learned not to translate uncertainty into catastrophe. He learned that vigilance did not mean panic. He learned that the body, once listened to, spoke plainly. When Ria saw him again at the wound clinic, she smiled with real pride at the healthy red granulation tissue crowding the base of the pocket. You're doing this, she said, as if he had lifted something heavier than a splinter. Your body's doing this. You're helping. He went back to the workshop after 4 weeks, slowly, like a swimmer returning to cold water. The cedar planks waited along the wall, their scent softer now. He swept sawdust into a neat hill and thought about how it all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back, how an invisible thing had lodged and then grown into a visible consequence. He picked up a fresh pair of heavy gloves, the kind he had always meant to buy but never had, because the old ones still had life in them. He put them on. He felt ridiculous and also smart. He wore goggles. He set a small trash can at the lip of the workbench for splinters and offcuts, labeled it with a thick marker, waste, because naming things made them real and manageable. On a gray afternoon, Leah found him standing in the doorway of the workshop, just looking. She leaned against the jamb and followed his gaze to the bench where he had sanded the day the itch began. What did it feel like? She asked. When they found it? He considered. The best he could do was this. Like finally understanding a word that had been on the tip of my tongue for months. Terrible, and also, a relief. The scar on his back would never be pretty. It traveled like a narrow river from the bottom of his shoulder blade to the flank. He traced it sometimes with the tips of his fingers, the way people trace map routes they have already taken. It was not a story he would boast about. It was a story he would tell when someone said, "It's nothing," and he would say, "Maybe. Or maybe it's your body asking you to look." The hospital followed him as institutions do, appointment cards, portal messages, lab draws. He kept going. He kept taking the antibiotics even when the taste haunted everything. He kept changing the dressing even when the tape made a rash. He kept watching for heat, for swelling, for a return of the peculiar itch that had started his ruin and his repair. And when he slept, finally, he slept without flinching, without dreams that made him claw at his own back, because the thing that had lived beneath his skin had been named and cut and carried away. It had become a lesson, and lessons had weight but not teeth. The day Dr. Klein cleared him, no signs of recurrent infection, the scar maturing well, he sat in his truck in the hospital parking lot and did nothing for a long time. He did not think about fate, or luck, or what could have been. He thought about the people who had steadied his shoulder, who had irrigated the hollow in his back, who had called him Daniel and meant it. He thought about how life could tilt because of a small itch, and how tilting could reveal a horizon you didn't know you needed. He drove home by the long road that ran along the river, windows cracked to let the early winter in. He was not cured of ignoring things, no one ever was, but he had been interrupted. He had been made to pay attention. And in the evenings, When the house exhaled and the TV murmured and Leah washed dishes with the water too hot, he would sometimes reach across his shoulder blade and feel the flatness where the hardness had been, and he would breathe, not easier, exactly, but truer. He carried many things. He had learned to set some of them down. It all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back. The man thought it was just a rash or an insect bite, something that would fade on its own. But within weeks, the itch turned into a hard lump that grew larger and more disturbing with each passing day. When he finally went to the hospital, doctors expected a routine case. But the moment they examined him under surgical lights, they realized this was far from ordinary. What they discovered growing from his back left the entire medical team frozen in disbelief, and the man horrified at what he had been carrying all along. That refrain stayed with Daniel like a clock he could hear through the wall, steady, inescapable. He found himself saying it under his breath at odd times, not because he wanted to relive the shock, but because the line contained the map of how he'd gotten here: a small itch, a larger silence, and then the truth bright as a scalpel. In the weeks that followed, he lived differently. He learned the language of aftercare: packing, flushing, measuring output, watching for warmth, naming pain without dramatizing it. He also learned what it meant to be witnessed. Rhea saw it first. At a follow-up in the wound clinic, she paused as she peeled back the last strip of tape, eyes catching on a faint, unusual tenderness at the superior edge of the scar. "Does that spot bother you when you reach forward?" she asked. He nodded. She didn't dismiss it. She palpated gently, tested his range of motion, and ordered an ultrasound to make sure no hidden pocket remained. The skin didn't show a new abscess, but a shallow cavity lingered, stubborn tissue slow to knit. It explained the ache when he threaded his arm into a jacket sleeve. "Not a setback," Dr. Sato said when he reviewed it. "Just a reminder that biology doesn't read calendars." Leah started coming over on Sundays with groceries and blunt questions. She emptied the fruit bowl, washed it, refilled it, then stood hands on hips and asked why his smoke alarm had a dead battery, why he had 3 nearly empty bottles of ibuprofen scattered through the house, why the workshop still had a box of old, cracked gloves on the shelf like a museum exhibit of bad habits. He bristled because bristling had been his armor for years, but she didn't back away. "You were carrying a piece of wood inside you," she said, voice softening at the edges. "That's a metaphor and a hazard. Let me help you put the metaphors and hazards in the trash." There were new people, too. An occupational therapist named Jay visited to assess how he moved. Jay had the practical cheer of a former athlete and the patience of a good math teacher. He watched Daniel reach, lift, and twist. He swapped out the heavy kettle for a lighter one and suggested moving the coffee mugs down to the second shelf. He taught him how to roll a small ball along the muscles next to the scar to ease the tautness. "You avoided using that shoulder for months," Jay said. "Now we retrain it to trust you again." They worked in quiet, interrupted only by Jay's small nods when the movement looked right. At the hospital, a medical student asked if she could speak with him for her case log. Her name was Mina, and she was all elbows and intent focus, a notebook balanced on her knee. "We're taught to think cyst and move on," she admitted. "But your story, what they discovered growing from your back, made everyone stop. It reminded me that pattern recognition is only as good as our willingness to pause when something doesn't fit neatly." Daniel studied her, surprised by how much it mattered that someone young and relentless would carry a sliver of his experience into rooms he'd never see. "Write down," he said, "that the itch was easy to ignore because I wanted it to be easy. Write down that the body whispers first." He began to write things down himself. He wasn't a journaler. He preferred screws and would glue to verbs. But a yellow legal pad appeared on his kitchen table, and then another. He wrote lists that turned into paragraphs, not about pain but about sequence. A carpenter's mind broke the world into steps. He described the first twinge after sanding cedar. He described the smell in the ore, metallic and wrong. He described the suction's chatter. He described Ria's hand on his shoulder like a weight keeping him from drifting. He wrote the title sentence in block letters across the top of a page. It all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back. Under it, he wrote, "I thought I knew what was ordinary." That sentence surprised him, so he circled it. Marco, the neighbor, asked if Daniel might help him repair a leaning gate. Daniel said yes because saying yes felt like a vote of confidence in the future without promising anything too loud. They worked slowly, measuring twice, drilling once, resting when his shoulder hummed. At one point Marco winced and shook his hand. A roofing staple had nicked him earlier that week. The puncture looked clean, but it was deeper than a scratch. Daniel's mouth moved before he had time to argue with himself. "Wash it. Soap and water. Then keep an eye on it. If it gets hot or red, don't wait." Marco laughed it off the first time, but by the third reminder he nodded, chastened. Daniel recognized the performance of invincibility because he used to star in it. There were medical detours he hadn't anticipated. The long course of antibiotics took its toll. His taste turned metallic, his tongue developed a map of sensitivities, and his gut negotiated loudly with dairy. A vein in his forearm flared and roped after N4, a tender strand announcing superficial thrombophlebitis. Warm compresses and an anti-inflammatory handled it, but the message landed. Even healing came with small alarms. Dr. Sato suggested a brief pause between courses and then a narrower, culture-guided restart. "We treat the organism and the person," he said. "Sometimes the person needs a breath." On a gray Thursday, the hospital called to squeeze him in for a quick MRI to rule out osteomyelitis, deep bone infection, because one lab value had nudged upward and refused to return to baseline. The word itself made the room colder. He lay on the narrow bed as the machine thumped and clanged like someone welding inside a drum. He counted the noises as if they were stairs. He kept his eyes closed and pictured the river road he liked to drive, the one that ran long and patient beside the water. When the results came back without evidence of bone involvement, he sat in his truck and pressed his palm to the scar in gratitude so plain it felt like relief turning into light. Leah convinced him to attend a community health workshop at the public library. The flyer said, "Minor injuries, major consequences," which sounded alarmist until he sat through the first case, a gardener who had pruned roses without gloves and ended up with sporotrichosis. A mechanic with a tiny metal sliver in his eye that resisted notice until it rusted. A teen who popped a pimple on his thigh that was a deep abscess in disguise. The nurse running the session, a brisk woman named Carol, asked if anyone wanted to share. Daniel raised his hand slowly. He didn't dramatize. He told the story in plain terms, including the line that had become part of his bones now. He watched strangers lean forward, their bodies understanding before their minds did that this wasn't a horror story so much as a map of how to pay attention. Afterward, two men stayed behind to show him scars of their own, as if they were trading passports stamped at the same silent border. Some nights were still hard. On the worst of them, when sleep refused him and the scar prickled with phantom heat, he went to the workshop and sat without touching anything. He looked at the bench, at the new gloves, at the labeled waste can. He let the quiet stack in layers until the room felt full of something like safety. Sometimes he dialed Leah and let it ring once, a signal they had invented when she was 12 and afraid after a bad dream. Back then he would pad down the hall and sit at the foot of her bed until her breathing evened out. Now, 20 years later, she sometimes turned the tables. She answered and talked about ordinary things until his chest unknotted. A recipe that went wrong because she mistook tablespoons for teaspoons. A coworker who believed the office plant needed motivational quotes. A stray cat who adopted her block and refused to be convinced otherwise. He started noticing the tiny moral math other people did with their bodies. At the hardware store, a man flexed his finger and said, "It's nothing," while his knuckle ballooned blue. At the diner, a waitress grimaced when she lifted a pot of coffee, then shrugged at her own face. The line that anchored Daniel's story, the one that began, "It all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back," rose again like a tide. He didn't lecture, but he asked small questions. "How long has that hurt? Does it feel warm? What would it cost you to call someone?" He learned that most people needed permission more than advice. One afternoon, Mina, the medical student, stopped him in the hospital corridor, her white coat wrinkled, her ponytail a little wild. "I scrubbed in on a case today," she said breathlessly. "A man with an old thorn in his calf. I recognized the smell before they did. I told them to consider actinomyces. They did. You were in the room, in a way." Daniel didn't know what to do with that pride, so he nodded and said, "Tell him to finish every last pill even when his tongue tastes like a battery." She grinned and promised. The scar paled. The tissue softened under the massage ball Jay had given him. He added 10 minutes to his walks and then 5 more. He carried the laundry up the stairs without wincing one morning and stood at the top surprised at his own body. He returned to the river road and rolled the windows down to let in the clean cold. He found that he didn't have to love the lesson to value it. It was at the farmer's market, months later, that the world gave him a scene so on the nose he almost laughed. A boy of 8 or 9 wailed near the honey stand, clutching his shoulder blade. His father said, "It's just an itch. Don't make a fuss," in the weary tone of a man stretched thin. Daniel crouched without intruding, eyes level with the boy's. "A small itch can be a message," he said gently. "Let's see what it's saying." The father bristled, then saw the scar peeking under Daniel's collar where the shirt had shifted. Something in the father's face settled. "Okay," he said. They checked. It was a mosquito bite. They laughed, relieved. The boy accepted a dab of cream like a badge of seriousness. As they walked away, the father glanced back, mouthed "Thank you." Daniel lifted 2 fingers in a small salute, thinking how close irritation and instruction lived. He didn't become a crusader. He didn't start a blog or a foundation or a campaign with wristbands. He built shelves with better gloves and taught Leah how to replace a smoke alarm battery without swearing. He showed Marco how to pry out a splinter from a fence rail and then dispose of it as if it mattered where such small knives slept. He kept the legal pads and filled them slowly. He spoke when asked. He stayed quiet when people needed to tell their own versions. He kept a fresh kit of wound care supplies in the hall closet not out of paranoia but because preparedness felt like respect. Some mornings he still ran a palm across his shoulder blade and remembered that first night sanding cedar, the grain catching in the light, the urge to finish one more board before dinner. He pictured the invisible moment when wood met skin and lodged, the body's alarm a mere whisper. He wished, briefly, that he could lean back through time and choose the gloves on the shelf, the pause, the washing of hands before the shrug. But wishing was a poor carpenter. Attention was better. So he paid it, to the breath, to the ache, to the sudden quiet that meant the house was listening back. And when the old sentence rose again, it all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back. He didn't flinch. He let it stand like a mile marker, proof of distance traveled, not a threat of return. He kept moving, measured, watchful, ordinary as rain, into afternoons that felt earned rather than borrowed, into conversations that landed where they needed to, into rooms where bright lights no longer meant the worst thing. And when he heard anyone say, "It's nothing," he smiled the way people do when they recognize a road and know every bend by heart, ready to walk it with them a little farther. It all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back. The man thought it was just a rash or an insect bite, something that would fade on its own. But within weeks, the itch turned into a hard lump that grew larger and more disturbing with each passing day. When he finally went to the hospital, doctors expected a routine case. But the moment they examined him under surgical lights, they realized this was far from ordinary. What they discovered growing from his back left the entire medical team frozen in disbelief, and the man horrified at what he had been carrying all along. That sentence kept finding Daniel even when he didn't look for it. It appeared when he tugged on a sweater too quickly and the fabric caught the old scar. It surfaced when he stood motionless in the cereal aisle, surprised by a wave of heat under the skin that wasn't pain, exactly, but memory. He had thought the worst was behind him. Mostly it was. But healing, he learned, didn't move in a straight line any more than lumber stayed perfectly true. It warped a little, then settled, then asked again for attention. At his 3-month check, Ria greeted him like family she actually liked. The wound had sealed. The scar lay pale and rope-thin. She tested his shoulder strength and smiled. You're stronger than last time, she said, then pressed lightly along the superior edge where a faint puckering remained. This bit is tethered. She showed him a set of scar mobilization moves. 2 fingers, slow circles, then a gentle lift. Nerves can get trapped too. Desensitization helps. She handed him a small kit from a drawer, a square of silk, a bit of felt, a piece of terry cloth. Brush each texture along the scar for a minute a day. Teach the skin that touch isn't danger. At home he did it because she asked, and because doing small things had slowly become his new authority. The first days felt ridiculous. He sat at the table dragging a swatch of silk over his shoulder like a magician who'd lost the rest of his trick. By the end of the week, the phantom sting under his skin dimmed in a way he could not have argued into happening. He added the drill to the list on the fridge. Brush, silk, felt, terry. Leah saw it and laughed softly. You're domesticating your nerves, she said, wiping a ring of coffee from the counter. Good. Leah brought someone to dinner, a quiet man named Jonah who worked as a civil engineer and loved maps enough to frame old topographical sheets as art. They ate roasted chicken, and the talk drifted to structures and load, to what failed when too much weight leaned on the wrong place. Jonah asked about the workshop, and Daniel admitted he hadn't built anything big since before the surgery. Jonah nodded like a person who understood the time it took to return to weight-bearing work. I keep a failure file, he said. Photos of small cracks before they turned into big ones. Not to scare myself. To remind myself where to look. Daniel thought of the sentence. It all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back, and realized he, too, had started a failure file, except his had been in a body. Dr. Sato called one morning with a tone Daniel had come to trust. Your labs look good, he said. And your exam looked good, but your last ultrasound did show a shallow tract we didn't love. It's likely just scar, but I'd like to get you in for a quick clinic debridement, local only. Clean up any granulation that's overzealous. The word tract scratched at an old fear, but the plan was minor, and the logic was clean. He agreed. In the procedure room, the light was bright but not cruel. Rhea numbed the skin with tiny stings, and Dr. Klein used the curette like a careful spoon, lifting a rim of exuberant scar that had been pulling at healthy tissue. There was no drama. The suction hummed, saline sparkled, and the bit of tightness that had nagged at him for weeks let go like a knot finally worked loose. That, Klein said, is your body taking instruction. Outside the hospital, life filled with modest errands that felt like votes of confidence. He got the oil changed and chatted with the mechanic about torque specs. He stood in line at the DMV because the temporary license had expired during the worst of the antibiotics. He bought 2 smoke alarm batteries instead of one, and changed both because it was easier while the step stool was out. He texted Leah pictures as proof, the ceiling tilted, his arm upstretched, his face a little sheepish. She replied with a string of exclamation points and a single heart, then wrote, I'm proud in a very obnoxious daughter way. In the workshop, he chose a project on purpose that required patience instead of muscle, a narrow bookcase for Leah with a simple face frame and blind dados so the shelves would look like they floated. He measured slowly, marked with a knife rather than a pen, and made every cut one shy of final, sneaking up on the line. He wore the new gloves even when muscle memory reached for the old ones out of habit. He pushed himself to stop when the scar hummed, then started again after a cup of tea and a look out the back window where the river of afternoon light ran the same way every day. When he slid the dry-fit shelves into place, and the joints seated with the soft kiss good joinery makes, something in his chest eased that had nothing to do with antibiotics. A letter arrived from the hospital's education department. Mina had submitted his case to be discussed at a morbidity and mortality conference, the weekly meeting where surgeons examined complications, oddities, and near misses to learn fast and deeply. They invited him to attend if he wished, not as a specimen but as a voice. He sat in the back of the auditorium the following Tuesday, collar stiff against the old nerves. The room smelled faintly of coffee and whiteboard marker. Slides flashed, an ultrasound image showing the ragged pocket, a photo of the retrieved fragment of wood laid next to a ruler, a diagram of actinomycotic colonies labeled sulfur granules, with a parenthetical. Not actually sulfur. A young surgeon presented cleanly and refused to turn the story into theater. He ended with a sentence Daniel recognized as Mina's. Pattern recognition saves lives, but only if we also stop when a routine pattern smells wrong. During questions, someone asked what could have been done sooner. The surgeon answered, "He came when he understood this wasn't ordinary. We could remind our patients earlier that small doesn't mean safe." The conference didn't applaud. They didn't do that here. But heads nodded the way trees nod in wind, small, collective. Daniel walked out into the hallway and found Mina there, her coat wrinkled, her grin unguarded. "You were brave," she said. "I sat in the dark," he said. "Still counts," she answered. The next season carried its own tests. Cold air made the scar prickle, hot showers eased it. A sudden strain while reaching for the last bag of softener salt made him bite back a curse and set the bag down, chastened. He called Jay, the occupational therapist, who added a new move, a broomstick stretch to open the chest and coaxed the shoulder blade to glide without complaint. "Scapulothoracic rhythm," Jay said, tapping his own back. "Your wing knows how to move. We're just reminding it." Marco knocked one evening in January, eyes wide in a way Daniel recognized. His wife, Alma, had an angry red streak up the inside of her forearm from a tiny cut she'd ignored at work. "It's nothing," she said from the doorway, embarrassed by the attention. Daniel didn't touch her arm. He just met her gaze and told her, "Red streaks point like arrows to places we shouldn't wait." They went to urgent care together. It was cellulitis, a straightforward course of antibiotics, an ink line drawn by the nurse to mark the boundary of the redness, and a promise to return if the line was crossed. Alma returned with cookies the next week and rolled her eyes at herself in a way that signaled relief more than shame. "I had my own version of your sentence," she told him, smiling. "It all started with nothing more than a small itch, only mine was a paper cut. Who knew paper could bite back?" Leah asked if he would come to her office one Saturday to help mount a map wall, for vintage topo sheets butted together to make a continuous ridgeline. He brought the stud finder and the level and a small bag of hardware because stores forgot essentials when you needed them. He measured, marked, and made her hold the level while he drilled. She took a photo of him mid-reach, the scar barely visible, a ghost more than a warning. Later, she posted the finished wall with a caption that sounded casual to everyone else and like a truce to him. "Built by the man who taught me to check twice and look closer." That night they ate noodles and told each other the small, refrigerator note version of their weeks. Leah admitted that the map wall had been for more than decoration. "I wanted to watch you move without wincing," she said, not quite looking at him. "I wanted to see you reach and not stop at the memory of pain." He laughed once, quietly. "I did wince," he said. "I just made it smaller." "I saw," she said, and squeezed his hand anyway. A call came from Carol, the nurse who ran the library workshop. She was starting a monthly hands and tools clinic for people who worked with wood, metal, and earth, gardeners, mechanics, carpenters, roofers. "We'll cover tetanus boosters and splinter removal," she said. "And the difference between a bruise and a hematoma." She asked if he'd tell his story in 5 minutes, then stick around to answer questions. He said yes before he could give himself time to build a reason to say no. The first session drew a dozen people, then 20, then more. He stood at the front of the room, not a charismatic speaker but a reliable one, and repeated the line every time because it framed everything else with clean edges. It all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back. He spoke in short sentences, the way people do when they don't want to waste anyone's attention. Afterward, people lingered with their specificities: this knuckle, that tendon, the bruise that wouldn't fade, the crescent of stainless lodged in a palm that a magnet had coaxed but not captured. He didn't diagnose. He translated fear into steps: wash, watch, mark the edge, seek help when thresholds were crossed. Spring arrived in a rush, the way it sometimes did, snowmelt turning the river high and urgent. He built a small planter box for the porch from cedar offcuts, the irony not lost on him. He sanded with the grain, back and forth, methodical. When a splinter lifted under the paper's drag, he set everything down, put on his glasses, and used tweezers to lift it clean, drop it into the waste can, and walk to the sink to wash his hands with soap and a small, firm patience. He did not narrate the moment to himself, did not turn it into a lesson, did not dramatize the ordinary. He just paid the toll. It felt like a kind of prayer that didn't require words. The hospital mailed the consent form a month later. A teaching journal wanted to publish a short case about the way routine had almost hidden an outlier. No photographs of his face, no names, only the wooden fragment next to the ruler, and the phrase, "Chronic actinomycotic granuloma surrounding a retained wooden foreign body." He read the document twice, then signed. In the comments box he printed carefully, "Please include a sentence that reminds readers to consider the person, not just the pocket of infection." Mina emailed him a draft page with that sentence tucked near the end. She added a quiet thank you that made his throat tighten. "For every patient after you." He met Jonah for coffee one Saturday at a place that served mugs heavy enough to count as exercise. They talked about bridges, the ones that failed quietly and the ones that failed loudly, the maintenance that mattered, the inspections that only meant something if people respected what they found. "We design assuming loads," Jonah said, sketching on a napkin. "But the world throws us surprises. Water finds the seam you didn't think water would find. Then it freezes, expands, and turns a hairline into a verdict." Daniel traced the line Jonah had drawn. "Bodies too," he said. "Surprises find seams. I didn't think a sliver could build a house in a person." He didn't intend to say the next part, but it arrived anyway. "I didn't realize how many parts of me were hairlines I'd never inspected." Ria announced she was leaving the wound clinic for a few months to help her mother recover from hip surgery. She told the regulars one by one in the exam rooms, not at the nurse's station where goodbyes got flattened into cake. "You'll be in good hands," she said to Daniel. "But I'll miss being bossy about your scar." He brought a small plant on her last day, a pothose because it forgave lapses and kept growing anyway. He tied a tag to the pot with twine from his workshop. "For all the places you taught to heal from the inside out." She hugged him with the kind of pressure that said both thank you and take care, and then left a space in the clinic that was noticeable even in the diagrams on the walls. There were nights he woke to a ghost itch in the exact square inch where it all had begun. He lay still and let his mind do what it had learned to do, inventory, not panic. Warmth? No. Swelling? No. Drainage? No. Just a nerve firing a memory. He reached for the silk square in the bedside drawer and brushed the line of the scar until the alarm softened back into background noise. In the morning, he wrote a note on the pad. "Not every echo is a warning." Summer pushed in and made every errand feel brighter and louder. He drove the river road with the windows down and passed a fender bender that had just happened, drivers out, hands fluttering, voices high. He pulled over, the way people did when they had gained a small authority over crisis. Everyone was fine, airbags had worked, the cars were bruised metal more than wreck. One woman held her forearm and insisted it was nothing. He saw the tiny seatbelt burn and the way she kept flexing her wrist. "Ice," he suggested. "And if your fingers tingle or the pain climbs instead of falling, get an X-ray. Small things don't have to prove they're big to matter." She nodded like a person hearing permission. He went home and finished the planter. He set it on the porch and tucked soil into corners with his fingers the way you tuck a blanket under a sleeping child. He planted rosemary and thyme because they were stubborn and forgiving, then added a small row of marigolds along the front, a ridiculous parade he admitted he wanted. Marco came by and sniffed the rosemary and made a face like someone remembering a good kitchen. Leah texted a photo later, her feet on the porch rail, the planter in the frame, the caption, "Evidence of thriving." When the journal arrived in his mailbox, a thin volume with a modest cover, he turned to the article and read it standing in his driveway, the way people read letters that change something even if they can't say what. There he was and wasn't, a case number, an age without a name, a mass without a narrative. He should have felt erased. Instead, he felt placed inside a web of learning that ran forward and backward through people he would never meet. The final paragraph included the sentence he'd requested, slightly edited into the starch of academic prose. Clinicians should attend not only to the lesion but to the patient's lived course, as delayed presentation often reflects patterns of underestimation rather than indifference. He closed the journal and held it in his palm like a tool he knew how to use. That evening he wrote on his pad, "I used to think resilience meant not needing anyone. Now I think resilience is a team sport." He added under it, "I am not a lesson. I am a person who carried wood and bacteria and shame, and then I carried attention instead." He cleaned the workshop, not as a ritual but as maintenance. He tuned the plane until it shaved translucent curls that fell like onion skin. He set a fresh blade in the utility knife and taped a note above the bench. Gloves. Glasses. Pause. He mounted a small first aid kit on the wall and stocked it like he meant it. He made a sign for the door from a thin slice of maple and burned letters in with a cheap branding iron that felt more delicate than it looked. "Come in slow." He smiled at the sign because it spoke to more than visitors. Sometimes, in the late afternoon light, he found his mind drifting back to the sentence that had framed everything. It all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back. He no longer flinched at the memory. He let it stand where it belonged, at the beginning of a road he had learned to walk with his eyes open. Then he put the sentence down the way a carpenter lays down a tool at the end of a good day, within reach, respected, not in charge. And he kept going step by step through rooms that no longer smelled like antiseptic and into evenings that sounded like the low, ordinary music of a house that forgave and held. It all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back. The man thought it was just a rash or an insect bite, something that would fade on its own. But within weeks, the itch turned into a hard lump that grew larger and more disturbing with each passing day. When he finally went to the hospital, doctors expected a routine case. But the moment they examined him under surgical lights, they realized this was far from ordinary. What they discovered growing from his back left the entire medical team frozen in disbelief, and the man horrified at what he had been carrying all along. That line lived in Daniel's mouth like a bead he rolled with his tongue, a reminder and a boundary. It kept him honest when the days slid back toward ordinary. He woke, he checked the scar with 2 fingers and a patient breath, he made coffee, he wrote a few lines on the yellow pad, and he did the small work that stacked up into a life. Spring thickened into real heat. The planter on his porch took the sun and answered with rosemary that scented his wrists and marigolds that refused to look tired. At the library clinic, Carol introduced a new session about watchful waiting versus wishful thinking, and the room filled with people who had carried small pains like smuggled contraband. Daniel spoke simply. He didn't turn himself into a warning poster, he laid out a path. During questions, a woman in a green jacket lifted her sleeve to show a coin-sized bump near her elbow, smooth and fixed. "I've had it 6 months," she said, almost apologizing. "It doesn't hurt." He drew a little diagram on a scrap paper, skin, fat, muscle, and said, "Some things didn't hurt until they did. This looked like something to have seen and named." She nodded, wrote down a clinic address, and squeezed his forearm in thanks as she left. 2 weeks later she returned with a thin scar and a pathology note that said, "Lipoma, benign." She waved the note like a small flag. The room clapped without making a show of it. Leah's life filled with her own projects, maps, reports, a stubborn office printer that misfed like a toddler throwing food. She came over on Thursdays bringing peaches, or soup, or just her chatter. One evening she held up a small, sun-spotted hand. "Look," she said with exaggerated gravity, tilting her wrist. He saw a crescent of redness where a bracelet had rubbed. "I caught it early," she said, grinning. "Soap. Ointment. Bandage. I heard your voice in my head." He rolled his eyes and felt warm all the way through. Riaz Pajos flourished in her absence. The wound clinic felt different without her, still competent, still kind, but missing the precise way she narrated pain down to size. On her last day before she left town, She had handed him a small card with a simple instruction. Keep listening. He tucked it into the frame of a photo on the mantel where Leah stood at 12 in a muddy soccer kit, triumphant and feral. The card looked like a caption. The workshop took him back in small increments. He planed a board. He sharpened chisels until their edges whispered through end grain. He cut dovetails badly, then decently, then well enough to make him smile. He taught himself to stop when his shoulder hummed, to ice, to roll the massage ball along the muscle rails near the scar, to start again without scolding himself. One Saturday he built a narrow tray for the kitchen spoons, just ash and oil, simple and right. He ran his fingers along the softened edge and felt the kind of satisfaction that didn't need witnesses. News spread in the neighborhood that he had started helping Carol with the clinic. People began knocking with questions they framed as jokes. Got a minute for a man who lost a fight with a hedge clipper? If I say nothing to worry about, do you make me sit in timeout? He never made fun of their nerves. He told them what someone had told him: wash, watch, mark, seek. He kept a fine-tip marker near the door to draw tidy circles around questionable redness and write the time beside it, turning panic into measurement. Who knew Sharpies were medical equipment? Marcos said once. Everything's medical equipment if it helps. Daniel answered, and meant it. A letter arrived from his older brother Thomas, a name that tasted like dust. They had not spoken in 5 years. Money on their father's truck, a hard word that didn't need to be that hard, silence calcifying until it became furniture. The letter was spare, a hospital logo, a date, a request. Skin cancer removed? Margins not clear. I could use a ride on Tuesday. No apology, no history, just the ask. Daniel read it 3 times, feeling the old shelves inside him sag under the weight of what they had not said. On Tuesday he drove to the outpatient dermatology suite and found Thomas thinner, his old linebacker chest turned into something gentler. They didn't hug. They walked side by side the way men who shared a history and a failure walked, parallel, cautious. The doctor explained Mo's surgery with clean, practiced patience. Cut, check, cut again until the edges were clean. Daniel watched his brother in the chair under the bright light, the same brightness that had once shown him the wooden shard. Their eyes met once. Daniel saw a flash of it there, fear under irritation. He didn't say it all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back. He didn't make it about himself. He put a hand on his own shoulder blade, just once, a private relay of steadiness, and Thomas saw that too. They sat together in the small waiting room between passes, plastic cups of water sweating on the table. Thomas tried to make a joke about his new forehead window. Failed, and then said quieter, I ignored it too long. Daniel nodded. Ignoring tried to make a career of me, he said. I retired it. The third pass brought clear margins. They drove to a diner with cracked red booths and ordered omelets they didn't finish. On the way out, Thomas gripped Daniel's forearm and said, Thanks, without elaboration. It stood like a beam where something had rotted. The library clinic added a practical segment about tetanus boosters. Carol held up a schedule like a classroom teacher. Decade, she said, tapping the chart. Every 10 years sooner if a nasty wound. They set up a free vaccination day with the health department. Jonah came to hang a whiteboard for sign-ups and ended up staying to register people. Talking to a farmer about rebar and a florist about wire cuts as if this were his native language. Leah arrived with a tray of muffins and then began quietly replacing the brittle tape on the first aid posters with fresh strips that actually stuck. It looked like a family repairing a roof before the rain. Mina emailed a scanned page from the journal with a note. Your sentence landed. It already showed up in rounds. He printed it and taped it inside a cabinet away from sunlight, not because he wanted to look at it every day but because some part of him needed to know it existed, that the shock had been metabolized into practice, into a habit someone else might use. Summer's heat pressed on the scar, then let go. He ran the river road in the truck, then on foot in short loops that asked only for his lungs and his attention. He bought a bright cap at the pharmacy not because he cared about how he looked but because cars saw bright things better. He became the kind of man who carried bandages in his glove box and a phone charger he never let drop below half. A teenager named Evan began hanging around the workshop on Saturdays, a neighbor's nephew with a skateboard and a restlessness that didn't know where to go. He watched Daniel sharpen, measure, cut. "It's boring," he said after an hour, honestly. "It's peaceful," Daniel said. "That's not the same thing." Evan shrugged and showed up the next week anyway. Daniel taught him to mark with a knife, how a pencil lied if you let it. He told him about grain, how it answered best when you listened to the direction it wanted to split. "Everything's easier if you work with the way it's built," he said, not planning the metaphor, letting it land anyway. One afternoon, Evan slashed his palm on a utility blade he had snapped wrong. He hissed through his teeth and went pale. Daniel didn't bark. He took him to the sink, ran water, pressed clean gauze, elevated, looked. The cut was clean and shallow. They washed again, bandaged, and sat while Evan's color returned. "Stupid," Evan muttered. "New," Daniel corrected. He sent the boy home with extra dressings and a lecture about blades sharp enough to respect. The next Saturday, Evan arrived with gloves and a look that said he had reclassified the workshop from boring to serious. By August, the card Ria had left, "Keep listening," had softened at the edges from dusting. He kept listening. At a hardware store, he heard a cough in the next aisle that stopped and then didn't. He walked around the end cap and found an older man steadying himself on a shelf, a trickle of blood at his temple where a box had fallen. "I'm okay," the man said, though his pupils told a different story. Daniel guided him to a chair near the service desk, asked simple questions, stayed until the man's wife arrived. It wasn't heroism. It was attendance. A small scare arrived wrapped in nothing, an itch along the lower edge of the scar one Thursday evening, not a ghost this time, a real, precise irritation. He stood in the bathroom mirror and examined the line. A pimple had formed at the edge where a hair follicle had been trapped by old scar. It was nothing and not nothing, an invitation to ignore or to care. He washed, used a warm compress, resisted the teenage urge to squeeze. He slept. In the morning, the redness had eased. He wrote in the pad. Attention turned anxiety into a task and then into nothing. He accepted an invitation to speak to a group of apprentices at a carpenters' union hall. 15 faces, a few tattoos, boots that had seen ladders. He brought the waste can and set it on the table, a ridiculous prop that said more than a slideshow. He told them the sentence, and they listened the way people listen when they know their work carries small knives inside it. After the talk, a woman named Rosa stayed behind. "My dad always said, 'Shake it off,'" she said. "Now he can't lift his shoulder." Daniel nodded. "Mine said, 'Don't make a fuss,'" he said. "I made a fuss. It saved the part of me that helped me build again." She smiled like someone who had been given permission to be inconvenient in a way that kept her whole. When Ria returned to the clinic in early fall, thinner and somehow brighter, he brought a cutting from the potholes in a jar of water. "It grew," he said. "Of course it did," she said. "You gave it room." She palpated his scar like reading Braille and declared it well behaved. "You listened," she said, tapping the card in his memory. He said, "You taught me how." The river dropped back within its banks. The map wall at Leah's office became a place coworkers pinned notes. "Ask me about this ridge. Look at this old quarry." Jonah finished a bridge retrofit and brought a photo, the new bolts shining like disciplined stars. Evan cut his first decent dovetail and swore softly in gratitude at Wood for forgiving beginners. And whenever a day tried to shrink his story to a headline, Daniel stepped back into the full paragraph. It all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back. He had carried wood and bacteria and the habit of minimizing. He had been opened, irrigated, stitched by hands that knew more than he did. He had learned to wash, watch, mark, seek. He had learned that ordinary held both danger and rescue. He kept doing the small things that summated into safety, into craft, into trust that didn't require pretending. He didn't finish telling it. He moved through it, errands and clinics and dovetails and porch herbs, letting the shock dissolve into practice, letting practice become the way he inhabited his body, his house, his town. And on nights when the scar sang a thin note, he brushed silk along it and breathed until the note blended into the rest of the music in the room. It all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back. The man thought it was just a rash or an insect bite, something that would fade on its own. But within weeks, the itch turned into a hard lump that grew larger and more disturbing with each passing day. When he finally went to the hospital, doctors expected a routine case. But the moment they examined him under surgical lights, they realized this was far from ordinary. What they discovered growing from his back left the entire medical team frozen in disbelief, and the man horrified at what he had been carrying all along. The year rounded toward its quiet months, and Daniel moved through them with the steadiness of someone who had learned his pace. He kept his follow-ups with Dr. Sato, who reviewed labs with his calm, clipped commentary. He traded dry jokes with Dr. Klein in the corridor. He sent Mina short notes when she forwarded new papers about retained wood in foreign bodies and the tricky infections they nurtured. He bought better gloves and used them. He sharpened knives when they dulled, not because he liked the ritual but because sharp tools treated the body better than stubbornness did. On a late afternoon salted with rain, he stood in the workshop and finished Leah's bookcase with a coat of oil. The wood drank, glowed, and went still. He carried it inside and set it against her wall, a simple piece that held a simple promise: weight distributed correctly, shelves meeting sidewalls square, nothing left to wobble. Leah slid a row of maps and paperbacks into place and ran her palm across the top. "You built a thing that holds," she said, almost to herself. He thought of how people tried to make a life out of luck and speed, and how much better it had gone when he surrendered to sequence. The clinic at the library found its stride. Carol rotated in guests: a hand surgeon who explained why some cuts demanded stitches, a physical therapist who taught the difference between good soreness and injury. Daniel spoke for 5 measured minutes at each session, and then listened. A man with a long-ignored blister under his heel, now infected, sat awkwardly in the front row, his face divided between shame and relief. A florist showed the thin welds of scars that roses had written on her forearms, and said she had made peace with gloves after 30 years of insisting she could feel the stems better without them. They all nodded at each other like people who finally recognized themselves in other bodies. There was one last scare because life did not tidy itself on command. In early autumn, a firmness bloomed along the inferior edge of the old scar. No larger than a pea, tender when he pressed it. He looked once in the mirror, and then set the mirror down. He called the clinic, not in panic but in practice. Ria booked him an ultrasound for the next morning and greeted him with that mixture of briskness and kindness she kept prepared for exactly this. The skin showed a small inclusion, a bit of suture material that had persisted and now irritated the tissue around it. Dr. Klein took him into the minor procedure room, numbed the area with a fan of lidocaine, and teased out a loop of blue like a fisherman lifting an old line from water. The relief that passed through him was quiet and complete. "Bodies sometimes ask for edits," Klein said, dropping the stitch into a tray. "We provide them." On the drive home, the sky pulled apart and showed a clean stripe of blue. He parked by the river and walked the bank until the knot of vigilance in his chest loosened. He did not feel foolish for coming in quickly. He did not rehearse what-ifs. He sat on a bench and watched a dog fail joyfully at chasing its reflection in the water. The thought landed, simple as gravity. He had refused the old story that waiting proved strength. He had chosen a better one. Thomas called more often. Their conversations meandered: old teachers, cheap cars that had lasted forever, their father's refusal to buy a new hammer when the old one just needed a handle. One Sunday, Thomas joined him and Leah for dinner, bringing an apple pie he admitted he had bought and pretended to bake. They laughed, and then did not ruin the moment with the old arguments. After the dishes, Thomas stood at the workshop door and looked at the bench. "Remember when we built that wobbly ramp for the mower?" he asked. "I remember you insisting it wasn't wobbly," Daniel said. "And I remember you falling off it," Thomas said, and they both smiled at the fair record of things. Evan, the neighbor's nephew, finished a small stool all his own, pine legs, ash seat, joints proud on purpose. He sanded it until it felt like a held breath and brought it to the library clinic like a prize. "My mom cries every time she looks at it," he said, embarrassed and glad. Daniel told him that making sturdy places to sit counted as public service. Evan shrugged, then admitted he had started carrying bandages and tape in his backpack, the way other kids carried stickers. "Cuts happen," he said. "I figure I can help without making a big deal of it." Daniel thought, not for the first time, how the language of care traveled faster when it was folded into ordinary hands. Mina finished her rotation and sent a photo from a different hospital, her new badge crooked in the frame. Her message was short. "More rooms. Same lessons." It pleased him that the sentence kept moving without him tugging it along. He carried the journal issue in the cab of his truck until the cover frayed, then slipped it into the workshop drawer with the spare blades and extra pencils. On a cool morning with sun clear enough to make decisions easy, Jonah invited them to a ribbon cutting for the small bridge retrofit his crew had completed. It wasn't a grand event. There were no podiums, just the town manager, a pair of ridiculous scissors, and a handful of people who cared about keeping weight where it belonged. Daniel watched the first truck cross. The bridge took the load without drama, which was the point. Jonah stood with his arms crossed, not smiling so much as releasing tension in increments. "It held," he said, not to crow but to record. Daniel felt the truth of it in his own shoulder, a structure inspected, repaired, trusted again. Back at home, the planter on the porch still gave him more rosemary than he needed. He started drying sprigs and tying them with twine, handing little bundles to the clinic volunteers and the neighbors who stopped by. "Evidence of thriving," Leah said, echoing her old caption. The marigolds, stubborn and bright, outlasted the month they were supposed to. He liked that in a flower. He gave one last talk that season, this time at the Union Hall for a larger crowd. He set the waistkin on the table as always and told the story without drama, keeping it anchored to the line that had taught him how to begin and how to pay attention. It all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back. He spoke about cedar dust, about a shard of wood, about bacteria that hid in plain sight, about how routine and surprise braided in the same body. He told them he had waited because waiting was easier to explain than worry, and how it had almost cost him more than a scar. He told them his doctors had been steady, that a nurse had taught him to narrate fear into steps, that his daughter had insisted on batteries and checklists and tenderness. He told them he lived now with a different definition of strength, not silent endurance, but timely attention. When he finished, the room didn't clap so much as exhale. It was a sound he had learned to love, the combined release of people who had been holding something too tight. Rosa, the apprentice with the father who could no longer lift his shoulder, came up and handed him a folded note. He unfolded it at the truck. It said, "I made a fuss." They listened. "It wasn't nothing." "Thank you." He sat with that a long time before starting the engine. The last loose ends knotted themselves neatly, not because life promised neatness, but because he had decided to meet it with better tools. He replaced the batteries before they chirped. He set the clinic dates in his calendar, and showed up even when he felt tired. He checked on Alma's arm and found only a faint line where the ink boundary had once been. He called Thomas on Tuesdays without waiting for a crisis to justify the call. He asked Leah to taste the coffee and tell him if he was getting it right. He trimmed the rosemary, he pulled the weeds, he swept sawdust into piles small enough to carry away. He placed the pothos cutting Rhea had rooted for her mother into a bigger pot and watched it send down aerial roots like questions answered with confidence. On the first cold night, he woke to the old echo of a phantom itch, only a memory spark, nothing more. He lay still, ran the silk square along the scar, and felt his breath step down a stair. In the kitchen, he poured a glass of water and looked through the window at the soft black outside. He remembered the bright surgical light that had found the wood, the spoon curve of the curette, the suction's chatter, the gauze packing that had trained his body to heal from the inside out. The past did not lunge, it simply stood where it belonged. He walked to the workshop and switched on the low lamp. The bench sat with its organized chaos, the first aid kit hung ready, the sign above the door said, Come in slow. He touched it with 2 fingers, a habit now. He pulled the yellow legal pad from the drawer and wrote a final page that did not try to outdo the others. He wrote, I learned to pay attention. I learned that attention was love in motion. I learned that a small itch can be the first sentence of a story that ends with people in a room, steady hands, clean light, and a life returned to itself. He set the pad down, turned off the lamp, and went back to bed. The house breathed its ordinary breath. He slept without flinching. In the morning, he would drink coffee and step onto the porch and pinch a sprig of rosemary between his fingers just to start the day with proof. The scar would lie there, quiet and unremarkable, the way a road looks after you have traveled it enough times to know where it bends and where it gives. The sentence that had once sounded like a warning had turned into a marker on his map, a way to honor where he had begun and how far he had come. It all started with nothing more than a small itch on his back. It ended with attention, with hands that knew what to do, with a daughter at the table, with neighbors at the door, with a body that had learned to speak and be heard. And when he stepped into the day, he carried no secret colony, no hidden shard, only the practiced grace of someone who had learned, finally and fully, to listen.